Well, David's been anointed, and he's also shown that he is the kind of king that Hannah prayed for, but he's not king yet. He's anointed, but not king. And so, very quickly, we find out through the course of the narrative that David has to go into exile because after David kills Goliath, everyone starts to get really excited about David. And David begins to become this really experienced warrior. And you even hear in the course of the narrative that the women of Israel start singing about David, and they compare him to Saul. And they say Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So after David's encounter with Goliath, he becomes a warrior that goes out and fights on Israel's behalf. However, he makes Saul really angry because Saul feels very competitive with David. And so Saul wants to have David killed. And we find out that after Saul has come up with the scheme to kill David, David goes on the run, and he goes to Philistine territory with 600 of his closest men, like a battalion of men. And they become mercenary soldiers, paid soldiers in the Philistine army. So they're no longer fighting for Israel, but David and his battalion of 600 men are now fighting for the Philistines. So this is kind of a bummer, right? He's on the run from Saul, and he is fighting for the Philistines. It's not exactly where you want to be if you're David. Throughout this running away from Saul and fighting as a mercenary soldier, the text records that David has 2 chances to kill Saul. He would be justified in doing it, and he could take over the throne because Saul wants to kill David. He has 2 chances to do this, but he doesn't. And he says both times, I will not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed, because remember, Saul was anointed by Samuel. But also keep in mind that David at this point in time has been anointed as well. And so he's also calling Saul to task for coming after him and trying to kill him. So Saul is willing to lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. So one of the things that I want us to do is think through some of the sources that we have at play here. A lot of 1 Samuel tells the story of David's rise, the history of David's rise, and how David becomes king. And then when we turn the page to 2 Samuel, we get what's called a court history. Now, these 2 different sources that we have that tell us the story of David in 1 and 2 Samuel. Sorry, my ramen noodles are done. I was just making some lunch. I'm going to finish telling you this before I eat my lunch, though. All right. So the first one that correlates with 1 Samuel is the story about how David comes to be king, how he rises from this lowly place and he gets anointed, and then he's on the run from Saul. So it's this whole story about how David becomes king. 2 Samuel is the story of what David does after he becomes king. So those are the 2 sources that we have going on here. Now, one of the things that I want you to think through is, when was the history of David's rise written? Well, it was likely written shortly after David takes the throne, kind of like Barack Obama and the Audacity of Hope, or I'm trying to think of other people. If Donald Trump had some sort of a rags to riches narrative, I don't think The Art of the Deal is that, but you're going to write that shortly after you take power. And that's what Obama did. So shortly after David becomes king, and we haven't gotten to that part in the narrative yet, he likely has written this story of how he got there. It's a wonderful story. It's a story of a kid who was a shepherd boy, and then he rises to be the highest in the land. And he is the kind of king that Hannah had prayed for. And God chose him, and he's noble, and he doesn't lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. So whose interest does it serve? Well, it serves to make David look pretty good, right? And then what function might it have fulfilled? Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is that the history of David's rise is an ancient apology. An apology was a kind of literature that you would have written after you've taken over some sort of power. And it's not like you're saying, I'm sorry for gaining all of this power. Rather, what you're saying is, I came to my position through legitimate means. And so, as you continue reading through the course of the story, through the story of David, you're going to find out that Saul and his son Jonathan, the rightful heir to the throne in Israel, both die in battle against the Philistines. And they die in battle against the Philistines at the same time that David is a mercenary soldier for the Philistines. And then after Saul and Jonathan die, David becomes king, and he has a limited amount of people that support him, and so it would make sense for him to write or have written something like an apology that says, hey, I came to the throne by legitimate means. I was not the one that killed Saul and Jonathan in their battle against the Philistines. I wasn't even there. And in fact, that is what 1 Samuel says. It says that David wasn't even there. And when he found out that Saul and Jonathan were dead, that he was devastated. And so it seems really likely to me that shortly after Saul and Jonathan died, David became king and wanted to gather more Israelites to start following him. And so he had an apology written that said, hey, I did not want Saul and Jonathan to die, and I came to the throne through appropriate means. They were killed in battle, and I wasn't there, and I'm not the one that did it. So take that for what you will. We have other ancient Near Eastern apologies. So, for example, this guy, he's a Hittite ruler. His name is Hattushili III, and after he takes the throne, he writes an apology, and he sends it out throughout the kingdom. He's taken over the throne from his brother, who was killed through kind of shady circumstances, but he has this apology written, and in it he says that he couldn't help it. He had to become king because Ishtar, the goddess, had chosen him. He was the youngest of his brothers. He was really unlikely to take the throne. He was also a mighty warrior. And he tried to let his brother be king, but what could he do? Ishtar had chosen him, and the other king actually was not that nice anyway. And so you might as well be happy about Hattushili taking the throne. What we see with the history of David's rise is kind of similar. It's a sort of thing that's like, Yahweh chose me. What was I supposed to do? I tried not to have Saul and Jonathan die, but they did. And now I have to be king. So that's probably what we have going on here. We're going to shift in our next lecture to David, who starts off as the king that that Hannah prayed for, and quickly shifts into something much more nefarious, something a lot more like Saul, unfortunately. But David, at this point, has become king, and he's making an apology, saying, hey, I didn't do this by nefarious means. I'm a good guy. You can be on my side.